So yeah, as you just heard, my name is Benjamin Rangel. I'm in Jan Vessel's lab since 2018, and today I'm going to talk to you about the behavioral effects of episodic retrieval during task switching and how they're explained by lingering conjunctive representations. So what I'm going to be basing, get this out of the way. What I'm going to be basing the idea of episodic retrieval on is basically the accounts of Neal in 1997, Hamel, of course, in 2001, 2004, and then the recent Frings et al. Paper in 2020 on the BRAC model. But essentially, episodic retrieval, if you're performing a simple task, simple reaction time task where you hit a right key for a right arrow, left key for a left arrow, is it not? There we go. You are observing the environment, the stimuli, the cues, the context, and encoding that during the task. You're also encoding your response as you perform the task, the action decision, the action effector. And then you are also observing the effects, perceptual and affective. And these different representations are bound together as a episodic memory trace or event file that can be retrieved throughout the rest of the task. And so for a task like this, you would have two of these event files created, one for the left arrow, one for the right arrow. So the idea goes that these are not, actively maintained, but rather they're stored in long-term memory until they are retrieved. And as you encounter new stimuli throughout a task, you will create a new event file, which is then added to long-term memory. So I'll just go through this figure first, and then I'll go through these. You're presented with a novel context or stimuli. You create the event file, bind it, store it in long-term memory, and then upon the presentation of any feature that is common to an event file, usually the stimuli, that event file is then retrieved into working memory. And these 5 features of episodic retrieval, I just want to put on the table really quick. One, that it's considered to be automatic, and it's initiated by the presentation of any part of that event file. So in the previous example, just the presence of the black arrow would presumably retrieve the said event file. 3, it can be a benefit or a detriment to task performance. So assuming you retrieve the proper event file, you can preload your response and the effects you would expect from the response. But if you retrieve the wrong one, you would preload, say, the wrong response. 4, retrieval strength degrades over time. This one is, up for interpretation as to how long a event file will be maintained in long-term memory. There's some studies, I believe Hamel in 2004 mentioned up to 4 seconds, but it just depends. But really the idea of it degrading over time is just that the event file you retrieve, if you're presented with a stimulus, would be the most recent one that was bound and stored, including that stimulus. And then finally, it's not specific to task relevant features. So for this one, I give the example of a recent paper by Nickel et al., where they would pair a distractor and a scene together, present it for 4 seconds in a different block, and then in another block, they were doing a task where you just have to discriminate the odd shape here. So obviously, this cross would be the shape that you would move to, and this is a eye tracking task. And if they presented the scene alone just for 1 second prior to this task, people's saccades would be slower in general in moving towards the cross. And then a proportion of the time, their eyes would actually move towards the distractor that was paired with the scene. And so the retrieval of the episodic trace actually caused people to act on something that was entirely task irrelevant. Okay, so our study is the idea that, or the question, does stronger binding and or representational strength in, say, a trial previous to the one you're looking at have a greater influence on the behavior in, say, 2 trials down, greater than if it had lower binding affinity or lower representational strength? So this basic diagram is just kind of laying out the, 2-back trial scheme here. So task A is, trial A minus 2. Someone performs task A, just a random name. Then they perform task B in trial n-n, and then in trial n, you look at their behavior as they return to task A. So they switch from task A to B and then back to A. Presumably, they will form an episodic trace or event file in trial n-2. It'll be bound, stored in long-term memory, and then upon a stimulus presentation that is common to this event file in task A again, 2 trials later, that event file will be retrieved. And the question is the strength of the event file at this point, 2 trials previously, does that affect behavior 2 trials later? So the current paradigm is this, and it was created by Mayer originally in 2002, and then kind of modified and expanded upon by Rangel et al. In 2017. So the basic scheme is this. The subject is looking at a computer screen. A shape will appear in the middle of this black square, or this square called the frame. And then after 500 millisecond delay, a target will appear in one of the 4 corners of the frame. So what they do is based on the shape that they're given, this one indicates vertical, they will respond to by moving the dot vertically, which would be the top left corner of the frame, meaning that they would hit the 4 key. So pretty basic. And then horizontal is triangle. So if the dot appears in that same bottom left, the correct key to hit would be 2 to move it horizontally to the right. And then finally, if they get a diagonal square and the dot is in the same bottom left corner, the correct key to hit is 5. So while they perform this task, they're maintaining, or they've stored 12 of these event files, unique event files, in long-term memory, and they can be retrieved as they proceed through the task. So let's say somebody's presented with a square, and this is prior to the target being presented, the black dot. Once they see the square, they have 500 milliseconds to retrieve the most recent event file that was added to long-term memory that included the square. So let's say we retrieve this one here. If the dot happens to arrive in the bottom right-hand corner of the frame, then presumably their reaction to it on this trial should be faster and more accurate because they preloaded the correct response. However, if it arrives in one of the other 3 corners of the frame, presumably this will hinder reaction time and accuracy because it's technically now an incorrect event file, meaning now this event file needs to be either overwritten or replaced entirely before they can perform the task, and that'll cost some amount of reaction time. All right, so the task design, they had 35 subjects, 800 trials over 8 blocks, and then they practiced with 30 untrained practice trials, so they were told just go as slowly as possible so you kind of understand the mapping of the shapes to the responses. And then during the actual task, feedback was provided if they had an error or an omission for 500 milliseconds for error, and then if they weren't fast enough, if they didn't respond within 2,000 milliseconds, faster. So just another layout here. You have a blank frame for 200 milliseconds. Then you're presented with the cue shape for 500 milliseconds. And then the target arrives 500 milliseconds after the cue and is on the screen with the cue until a response is made or 2,000 milliseconds is up. During this, we had EEG recorded with a 64-channel active electrode cap connected to ActiChamp amplifier. It was sampled at 500 hertz, and the reference was PZ and the ground at FC. So moving forward from this point on, the trials are analyzed as triplets. So the naming scheme will be ABAS for a task repeating after an intermediate task, but the location of the target, the dot, switching. So we see here you have the hexagon, and then it doesn't matter if this is a square or a triangle, but then you return to the hexagon, but the dot is now in a different spot. So ABAS. Similarly, this is a 2 hexagon here, whatever here, and then a hexagon again, but you see the dot returns to the exact same spot. So that's ABA repeat or ABA-R. And then CBA trial triplets are where it's a unique shape for each one of these 3. So presumably, because in ABAS, for example, the n-2 target does not match the n target, the incorrect event file will be retrieved on trial n here, and you would predict a decreased a decrease in performance, i.e. greater reaction time and lower accuracy. Whereas in ABA-R trials, the correct event file should be retrieved. Therefore, you'd predict increased performance, lower reaction time, greater accuracy. And then for CBA, that's kind of the baseline where you, which you compare ABA-S and ABA-R to. And so we found basically that reaction time over the 35 participants. We see here for ABA-S trials, the orange bar was much slower than both ABA-S, much slower than ABA-R and CBA trials, which makes sense because they would have retrieved the incorrect event file. You do see a numerical increase in reaction time here for ABA-R compared to CBA, but these are not statistically different. So there was no real benefit. If anything, there's a detriment to ABA-R. And I could talk about that at the end because it's kind of a weird finding. And then for accuracy, again, you see a significant decrease in ABA-S trials, again, because they retrieved the wrong event file. And then you do see a benefit for ABA-R trials with increased accuracy here. So now we want to look at, now that we can see that this has manifested behaviorally, how does this relate to representational strength? And so I'll just point out to this red text box here. These methods are highly adapted from Kikumoto and Mayer 2020. Very similar, obviously, and I'll point out where they are different. But it begins with linear discrimination analysis, which is essentially how you can classify different classes of whatever by drawing a linear decision boundary between them. And in our task, there's 12 classification profiles. So 4 dot locations for 3 different cues. So we needed to classify each trial as one of the 12. So EG was pre-processed, pretty standard, automatically screened for outliers using joint probability and kurtosis. The data was epochhed into a negative 600 to 800 milliseconds, so it's target locked. And then it was downsampled to 250 hertz. And then we removed stereotypical independent components for blinks and such. The linear discrimination analysis was performed in MATLAB using the fit to script function. And then it was cross-validated using the one-out cross-validation, so not fourfold cross-validation. And here's one of the main differences between this study and Kikumoto and Mayer. One, they did use fourfold cross-validation, but also they used time frequency outputs. They had 5 frequency bands average, or yeah, 5 averaged time frequency bands. We used all 63 channels of the EG, so this is an ERP space. So that's the main difference. Okay. So once you perform LDA, let's say the correct profile here is the triangle with the dot in the bottom left, you get a vector of posterior probabilities, each representing the odds that that trial at that time point, because this is done at every single time point, I didn't mention that, but it's done at every time point for every trial, is this profile. So an ideal output would be something like this, where the odds for this triangle dot here is 0.25, let's say, and then there's some confusion with the other triangle types at 0.15, then the others have very low probabilities. And this looks familiar. So you would take these posterior probabilities and you would then regress them onto a set of confusion matrices representing the stimulus, response, rule, and conjunction. The rule in this case would be the shape, and the response would be the key, and then the stimulus would be the dot location. And yeah, I won't linger on this because it's been talked about already, but the resulting T values were then used as a measure of representational similarity for each one of these features, the 4 features. And these were the results. So again, remember this is an ERP space, so it's kind of surprising how good they were. But we do see Q, target, and conjunction representations were highly significant here. Q in blue, target in this red, orange, and then conjunction in purple. Now, strangely, and I'd like to hear if anybody has an idea of why this might be, but the response was not successfully represented. You can see I plotted the mean reaction time here for all subjects. So even leading up to that, we didn't get anything significant. However, I won't show this in this presentation. When we time locked RSA to the response, you do see significant response representation, but just not for when it's target locked. So taking the RSA outputs here, it was then put through a mixed model. So this plot right here is predicting reaction time from trial N by the RSA from trial N. So we're not yet predicting trial N reaction time by trial N minus 2 yet. So this is just the same trial. The RSA values were the independent variables, and subject was the random variable. And what we see is that first, after Q is presented, there is a negative T value here. Negative T value means that the Q, the higher the Q representation, the faster the reaction time. So greater Q representation here, if you just look like right about where it peaks, produces faster reaction time, which does make sense. However, once the target is presented, you see a divergence between the different representations. And again, this would be something I'd be interested if anyone had an idea of, because similar to Meyer and Kikumoto, at least in this portion right here, you see response, Q, and conjunction all predicting faster reaction times, whereas target never does and pretty much immediately begins to predict slower reaction times. As you move further through the task, response and Q begin to kind of trail back to 0, whereas conjunction continues to climb and eventually predicts slower reaction times similar to target. Okay, now this is all trials. So this is ABA-S, ABA-R, and CBA together. So if you look at just the ABA-S versus CBA, you see a very similar pattern actually. So we can't really look at, so yeah, I'll just say again, these are FDR corrected at 0.05. You see essentially the same pattern for ABA-S trials alone, where target immediately predicts slower reaction times. Now conjunction doesn't predict faster early, but Q and response follow the same patterns. And then it's essentially the same pattern for CBA trials. So the RSA values in the trial N have the same pattern between ABA-S and CBA trials. So there's not much information to be gained by that. So now we do look at the RSA values from trial N-2 and N-1. So this was another mixed model, where we included the Q, target, response, and conjunction. But in addition to that, interactions between all RSA representations and each trial condition were included. Now, ABA-R trials were excluded because there aren't as many of them in this paradigm. So it's just ABA-S versus CBA. CBA was the reference group. And these t-values in both of these plots are the t-values for the interaction between each of these representations and ABA-S trials versus CBA. So what that means is, if we look at trial N-2, predicting reaction time in trial N here, we see that beginning around 350 milliseconds, target, conjunction, and response all begin to predict slower reaction times in trial N as a function of the RSA values in trial N-2. Q begins to go lower, as you can see. In trial N, the N-1 here, there's no predictive power of the RSA values. So the RSA values here show no predictive ability for the reaction time in trial N. And one thing that I liked about seeing this is that you can kind of rule out just a general increase in RSA amplitude or values in a trial subsequent to the one you're looking at for the reaction times doesn't seem to produce just faster reaction times or slower reaction times. It's specific to the previous trial where the event file is going to be retrieved from. So now I'll just take a closer look at trial N-2 here. So this is this exact same plot, except now the p-value is uncorrected. It's just p minus 0.05 or less than 0.05. And what you can see here now is when it's just less than 0.05, you skip these little bits of significance early, but the main trends here show the same. Slower reaction times for response, conjunction, and target, and then faster reaction times for Q. And these line plots, and pardon the logged RTs here. I'm new to R, so I didn't know how to change them back before I could using this package. But these line plots are just showing the interaction. So the darker color is CBA and the lighter color is ABA-S, but blue for Q, red for target, so on and so forth. So they're the same. And these are only applying to the average, average RSA values in the shaded region. So what we can see here is that compared to CBA, at least for Q, there is a significant interaction, meaning that ABA-S trials shows a significantly different slope. And we see that it shows a speeding of reaction times as RSA strength increases, whereas CBA is either positive or non-significant. Target, similarly, CBA trials don't really show much here, but target shows a very positive slope here, producing slower reaction times as RSA strength increases. We see the same for response, and then similar for conjunction. So the question is, why of the 4 representations here is Q the one that produces faster reaction times, while the other 3 seem to predict slower reaction times 2 trials later? And I think the answer is that Q is the only representation that doesn't involve like a mismatch of an event file. So for example, if the strength of Q, the Q representation in trial n-2 here is strong, then when it's going to be retrieved in trial n prior to the presentation of the target. So there's a space where just a greater representation of the Q of the task's demands, so moving the dot vertically in this case, are going to be retrieved and then prepped prior to the dot arriving. And so it would make sense that this is the only representation that does produce faster reaction times, even in ABA-S trials, simply because it influences just the task demands in general, not necessarily which response you're going to make in response to which target you're going to be presented with. These, on the other hand, are in response to the target location. So once the target location is presented and it's not what you retrieved, it would make sense that the representation of the target and the response and the conjunction then produce slower reaction times, because they are including what it was, I'm rambling, but what was retrieved and is no longer accurate. So yeah, that's the main finding. That's the most exciting finding, that the representational strength 2 trials previously with an intermediate task switch can predict the reaction time and accuracy, well, not accuracy, the reaction times in trial N following episodic retrieval. Okay, so with that, I'll just thank the Cognitive Neurology Lab, Jan and Elliot, because they've helped me a lot with this and given me advice. The university, all this grant support here, for giving me the opportunity to be here doing fun and interesting things. The CCC, of course, and all of you for listening. Thank you.